When Josephine Langley stepped through the crooked doorway of the cabin beyond Dry Creek Ridge, the smell hit her first ash-boiled beans and old cloth left too long without soap or sun. The room was dim lit only by the slow burn of a hearth, and silent except for the faint creak of the door swinging behind her. 6 pairs of eyes stared from a rough wooden table. A 7th lay wrapped in a worn quilt inside a wooden crate by the fire, the baby too young to know it was waiting for something that might never come again. Tom, the boy, who had met her at the station, set down her trunk with a dull thud. "That was Pa's chair," he said, pointing to the empty seat at the head of the table. Josephine didn't speak. She simply nodded and left the chair untouched. A girl rose slowly. Her hair was in 2 braids, cheeks smudged with ash, a wooden spoon clenched in her hand like a weapon. "I'm Ellie," she said. "I stir things. Mama used to before she bled out after Henry." Her voice was steady, too steady for someone so small. Josephine stepped closer to the pot on the hearth. Inside thin broth floated with 2 lonely beans and a single potato sliced 7 ways. Her chest ached. She could turn back, she thought, leave before the children gave her a name she wasn't ready to carry. But the way the girl stared, not with hope, but with expectancy, made something hard and rooted rise in her. Without a word, Josephine rolled up her sleeves. She poured in the last of her water canteen, pulled dried herbs from her bag, and reached into her skirt pocket for the piece of salted pork she'd hidden from the conductor back in Kansas. It wasn't much, but it changed everything. The scent curled upward, smoked rosemary meat. The children leaned forward without knowing they did. Even the baby stirred. She ladled the stew into mismatched bowls, handed them out carefully. "Eat slow," she said. "Let your stomach remember it." No one asked who she was. No one questioned why she'd stayed. In a world that had forgotten how to welcome strangers, this woman had fed them, and in that one act, she'd earned the oldest kind of right, the right to remain. After supper, she watched them wash up in a tin basin behind the cabin. Tom stayed inside, sitting in the chair that had once been his father's shoulders, square like someone twice his age. Josephine stepped onto the porch, the stars above like pinpricks in a heavy sky. Her hands ached from chopping her back from the train. But she'd stayed, and that meant something. Later inside, she found a loose board beside the hearth. Beneath it, tucked in an old sack of oats, was a ledger no thicker than her palm. She opened it like it might break. Inside were dates, births, harvests, deaths, a half-sketched chicken coop, and on the last page in a rough dying hand, "Josephine Langley arrives June 3rd. She has nothing but will give her everything we've got." Her throat closed. The man she had come to marry had known he wouldn't live to meet her. And still, he had sent for her. Not for himself, but for them. For these children, with their hollow eyes and unspoken prayers. He hadn't asked her to save them, only to see them, to stay if she could. Josephine folded the ledger closed, tucked it back where she found it. Then she sat down beside the baby's crate and whispered, "I didn't come for love." She placed a hand gently on the child's chest, felt the tiny rhythm of its breath. But maybe she whispered, "I came for something greater." And in that moment, with no title, no wedding, and no ring, she became something no court or preacher could name. She became home. At dawn, smoke rose from the eastern ridge, thin and gray, curling like a question mark across the pink morning sky. Josephine stood in the doorway of the cabin, the baby asleep behind her, The rest of the children tangled in quilts that still smelled of ash and rosemary. The night before had been quiet, almost kind, but this morning carried the weight of something shifting. She said nothing, not at first. Let the children laugh while they chased each other barefoot across frost-bitten grass. Let them believe in morning for a little longer, but Tom saw it. He returned from gathering kindling with a bundle in one hand and suspicion in his eyes. "That's not chimney smoke," he said, his voice low. "Too dark, too far." Josephine nodded. "Anyone ever pass through that way?" He shook his head. "Only traders, and not this early." She didn't like the feel of it, how the smoke moved, but the air didn't. They had no locks on the door, only a wooden bar that creaked when dropped into place. That night she let the stew boil longer than needed and told Ellie to keep the baby close. The younger boys noticed her unease and grew quiet, the room thickening with tension, like weather about to break. After the children drifted to sleep, Josephine stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in an old wool shawl. The stars were out cold and unwavering. Tom joined her silently. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. "That someone's come," she replied. "Not for us, for the land." Tom frowned. "You think Pa owed someone?" "I think men see emptiness and mistake it for permission." In the distance past the tree line, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A man on horseback. He didn't approach. He just watched, then vanished into the smoke. That night, Josephine didn't sleep. She wrote by candlelight, though she had no one to send a letter to. "If I fall," she scribbled, "let it be known I came with nothing," and still tried to make something grow. By morning the smoke had cleared, but 2 hens were gone and the wood pile trampled. A message, she thought. Not damage, just warning. She didn't speak of it to the children. Instead, she told stories while they peeled potatoes and quietly tucked the broken latch from the barn door into the pocket of her apron. By late afternoon, the man arrived. He rode a tall chestnut horse and wore a duster stained from travel. No noise announced him. No dust cloud or dogs barking. He dismounted slowly, moved like someone who'd seen war and buried pieces of himself across the plains. "I'm looking for Richard Walker," he said, his voice worn smooth by wind and miles. "He's dead," Josephine replied. "Snakebite. 2 weeks past." The man nodded like he expected it. "I'm Warren Walker, his brother." Tom's head jerked up. "Pa never said he had a brother." "That sounds like him," Warren muttered. "We didn't part kindly." Josephine narrowed her eyes. "Then why are you here now?" Warren unstrapped a leather satchel and handed her a ledger nearly identical to the one she'd found under the hearth. Only this one was full. Letters, notes, sketches. On the final page, in Richard's unmistakable hand, were the words, "If I die before she arrives, let her keep the house. Let her raise them if she chooses. And if she doesn't bury this with me. And forgive me for hoping." Josephine's hands trembled, but not with fear. "I'm staying," she said. Warren nodded. "Then I'll leave you one thing more." He reached into the satchel again and placed a small brass key in her palm, to the safe under the floorboards. "It's not much, just the last eggs he ever saved." She didn't smile, but the weight of that key in her apron felt heavier than gold. It felt like belief, quiet, written, and waiting. At dawn, smoke rose from the eastern ridge, thin and gray, curling like a question mark across the pink morning sky. Josephine stood in the doorway of the cabin, the baby asleep behind her. The rest of the children tangled in quilts that still smelled of ash and rosemary. The night before had been quiet, almost kind, but this morning carried the weight of something shifting. She said nothing, not at first. Let the children laugh while they chased each other barefoot across frost-bitten grass. Let them believe in morning for a little longer, but Tom saw it. He returned from gathering kindling with a bundle in one hand and suspicion in his eyes. "That's not chimney smoke," he said, his voice low. "Too dark. Too far." Josephine nodded. "Anyone ever pass through that way?" He shook his head. "Only traders, and not this early." She didn't like the feel of it, how the smoke moved, but the air didn't. They had no locks on the door, only a wooden bar that creaked when dropped into place. That night, she let the stew boil longer than needed and told Ellie to keep the baby close. The younger boys noticed her unease and grew quiet, the room thickening with tension like weather about to break. After the children drifted to sleep, Josephine stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in an old wool shawl. The stars were out cold and unwavering. Tom joined her silently. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he asked. "That someone's come," she replied. "Not for us, for the land." Tom frowned. "You think Pa owed someone?" "I think men see emptiness and mistake it for permission." In the distance past the tree line, a flicker of movement caught her eye. A man on horseback. He didn't approach. He just watched, then vanished into the smoke. That night, Josephine didn't sleep. She wrote by candlelight, though she had no one to send a letter to. "If I fall," she scribbled, "let it be known I came with nothing and still tried to make something grow." By morning, the smoke had cleared, but 2 hens were gone and the woodpile trampled. A message, she thought. Not damage, just warning. She didn't speak of it to the children. Instead, she told stories while they peeled potatoes and quietly tucked the broken latch from the barn door into the pocket of her apron. By late afternoon, the man arrived. He rode a tall chestnut horse and wore a duster stained from travel. No noise announced him. No dust cloud or dogs barking. He dismounted slowly, moved like someone who'd seen war and buried pieces of himself across the plains. "I'm looking for Richard Walker," he said, his voice worn smooth by wind and miles. "He's dead," Josephine replied. "Snakebite. 2 weeks past." The man nodded like he expected it. "I'm Warren Walker, his brother." Tom's head jerked up. "Pa never said he had a brother." "That sounds like him," Warren muttered. "We didn't part kindly." Josephine narrowed her eyes. "Then why are you here now?" Warren unstrapped a leather satchel and handed her a ledger nearly identical to the one she'd found under the hearth. Only this one was full. Letters, notes, sketches. On the final page in Richard's unmistakable hand were the words, "If I die before she arrives, let her keep the house. Let her raise them if she chooses. And if she doesn't, bury this with me. And forgive me for hoping, or be." Josephine's hands trembled, but not with fear. "I'm staying," she said. Warren nodded. "Then I'll leave you one thing more." He reached into the satchel again and placed a small brass key in her palm. "To the safe under the floorboards. It's not much, just the last eggs he ever saved." She didn't smile, but the weight of that key in her apron felt heavier than gold. It felt like belief, quiet, written and waiting. It wasn't just a roof Richard gave them. He gave them the first brick of a home, and now she said, voice steady, "I'll build the rest." The wind shifted, then carrying the faintest scent of lilac, impossible in that dust-choked land. As if spring had taken one small step forward. Inside the cabin, the fire didn't flicker. It glowed, and in that quiet place, not marked by maps or titles, Josephine Langley became something no man had written down necessary. The cough started just after sunrise. At first it was faint, barely more than a hitch in Jonah's breath. But then he gripped the hem of Josephine's skirt with shaking hands. His cheeks flushed red and eyes glazed with heat. The spoon slipped from his fingers, clattering against the wooden floor. By noon, Ellie had gone quiet, her face, pale lips dry and cracking. Josephine pressed a damp cloth to her forehead, whispering comfort. She didn't believe. One by one the children fell, 4 of them burning with fever, sprawled across quilts that still smelled of smoke and old stew. The baby no longer cried, just lay still, breathing in short, shallow bursts that barely moved the thin quilt wrapped around him. Josephine didn't sleep. She rotated cloths, stoked the fire, and whispered lullabies she hadn't known she remembered. Her palms blistered from hauling water. Her back screamed from leaning over sick beds, but she never stopped moving. The baby's silence scared her more than any noise ever could. She didn't send for help. There was no one to send for. Dry Creek was 5 miles of dust and whispers, and the nearest town more than a day's ride. Illness moved faster than news ever did. On the 3rd night, with the fire nearly out and her knees shaking beneath her, Josephine knelt on the floor and folded her hands, not out of habit, but out of desperation. "Don't take them," she whispered. "Take anything else, but not them." The fire, which had been choking to embers, flared. At first light, Warren arrived without knocking. He brought firewood, salted pork, and most of all a stillness that calmed the storm inside her. He took one look through the cabin door and stepped in without a word. They didn't talk much. There was no time for talk. Together, they built a steam tent, using blankets and boiling water. Warren held the little one steady, while Josephine spooned broth between their trembling lips. She sang when her voice could hold, hummed when it couldn't. By the end of the 4th night, Ellie opened her eyes. Jonah stirred and whispered for bread. Even the baby whimpered again, a sound so small it shook Josephine to the core. Tom, who had fallen sick last, was too weak to smile, but he reached out and took her hand. "You stayed," he whispered. Josephine nodded, her voice breaking. "There was never a day I wouldn't." That night, for the first time in nearly a week, she didn't sleep curled in a chair or slumped on the floor. She lay down in the middle of them, arms wrapped around the children, who had once looked at her with suspicion. Now they breathed because of her, and in their breath they gave her something no court, no preacher, no paper deed could ever grant. Mother. She hadn't earned it through blood or law or title. She had earned it through sleepless nights, trembling hands, and a love that asked for nothing but a chance. In the still dark of that frontier cabin, with the fever broken and dawn rising slow beyond the hills, Josephine Langley became more than a woman who had been sent for. She became a woman worth staying for. Word traveled as fast as fever in places like Dry Creek, faster when it came wrapped in scandal. By week's end, they came. 2 riders in clean boots and lawman tones, with papers folded neat in their coat pockets and smugness stitched into the creases of their faces. Josephine heard them before she saw them. The hollow clatter of hooves, the way one of them spat before even reaching the porch. "We heard the bride finally showed," said the taller man, grinning. "But no wedding means no rights. These children, they're unclaimed now." The other held out a folded document stamped in red, sealed with a county judge's mark. This land was in debt. Richard Walker never paid it off. "These children are wards of the county now. We're here to escort them to proper placement." Josephine didn't flinch. She stood in the doorway, arms folded, shoulders square. "I have a letter, a deed, witnesses." The short one chuckled. "That might hold in town. But you're out here. Out here, it's just what you can prove and what you can protect." Behind her, the door creaked. Tom stepped out first, rifle in hand. The barrel was rusted. It wasn't even loaded, but his eyes were. Ruth followed, barefoot, arms crossed, the baby slung on her hip. Ellie stood silent behind them, chin up. "We're not going anywhere," Tom said. "She's our family now." Ruth added, voice hard as nails. That's not your decision, boy, one of the men snapped. Then whose is it? Ruth asked. Pa's dead. Ma's buried. And this woman stayed when she could have run. Josephine placed a hand on their shoulders, her voice steady but low. You'll do no taking today. The men stepped forward. Then Warren appeared, quiet, slow shotgun resting across his arms, like it belonged there. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any gunshot. The county men hesitated. They spat, muttered about paperwork and sheriffs, then turned their horses. They left not because they were outnumbered, but because they'd been seen. And when a house stands firm, even cowards recognize it. Josephine watched them vanish into the horizon. Then she turned to Tom, whose hands still trembled on the rifle. You stood for me, she said. He looked up. You stood for us first. And in that moment, something changed, not in name, not in law, but in truth. The kind that didn't need a courtroom to be real. Later that week, Josephine stitched new curtains from old flour sacks. Ruth boiled soap over the fire, her voice louder than ever as she barked orders to the younger boys. Tom chopped wood in double shifts, his back straighter, his shoulders squarer. Each night they sat at the table, not in silence but in story. Neighbors began to arrive, not to take but to give. A widow from the next valley offered dried apples. An old rancher brought seed potatoes. Even the preacher who'd once scoffed at women taking land with no rings on their fingers sent a bundle of books tied with twine. No one asked who the mother was anymore, because by then they already knew. That winter, when the wind screamed down the ridge and the roof shook like it remembered being abandoned, Josephine sat in her chair by the fire. The baby napped against her chest. Ruth read aloud from a storybook with frayed edges. Tom stirred the stew, and not a single child looked over their shoulder. They didn't need to. Home was no longer something they hoped for. It was something they had built together. Winter settled early that year. The snow came heavy and fast, blanketing Dry Creek Ridge in a hush that seemed to muffle even the wind. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of sky that made a body brace their shoulders out of habit. But inside the cabin, something had changed. Where once there had been silence and hunger, there was now rhythm. Small, warm things, the sound of stew bubbling, Ruth's voice teasing the boys while she mended socks, Tom chopping wood with a practiced swing that belonged more to a man than a boy. Josephine watched it all from the doorway with quiet pride, a shawl around her shoulders, and the baby tucked against her hip. There was still no gold, no title, no paper that said she belonged. But the walls of this house no longer echoed. They answered back. One morning, just before the snow turned, the ridge impassable, Josephine heard a sound that didn't belong to the wind. A slow crunching of boots in frost, hesitant and light. She opened the door before anyone could knock. There, at the edge of the gate, stood a girl no older than 16, barefoot, wind-chapped, eyes sunken with exhaustion. In her arms, a baby wrapped in what looked like an old curtain. The girl didn't speak. She only stood as if unsure whether she had arrived or was still dreaming. Josephine didn't ask who she was or where she'd come from. She didn't need to. She recognized the look, that thin line between survival and surrender, the same one she'd worn stepping off the train months ago. "You're not late," Josephine whispered, stepping forward with a patched quilt. "You're right on time." The girl collapsed into her arms. Her name was Liza. The baby had a cough, but he was breathing. Ruth took him without hesitation, wrapping him in a warmer blanket. Tom made tea. None of them asked questions, because in this house the only answer that mattered was presence. That night, while the fire snapped and the children dozed, Liza sat beside Josephine in the quiet. Her hand shook as she held the teacup, her voice barely more than air. I didn't think anyone would open the door. Josephine placed a gentle hand over hers. This house doesn't lock. Liza cried for a long time. Then she helped make breakfast. And then she stayed. What began as survival slowly grew into something else. The cabin became more than a shelter. It became a fire passed from hand to hand, warming whoever needed it next. People began arriving with less fear and more purpose. A widower from the southern ridge brought tinware in trade for soap. A teacher from the town passed along old school books wrapped in oilcloth. A Choctaw woman came on snowshoes offering dried berries and salve in exchange for a place to warm her feet. No one knocked. They didn't have to. The smoke from the chimney spoke for them. The house itself grew. Tom helped Warren extend the porch. Ruth patched the roof with old tar paper and grit. Josephine stitched window coverings from what had once been flour sacks and seed bags. Liza learned to mend boots and rock babies at the same time, and slowly the questions stopped. No one asked who owned the land. No one wondered if Josephine had a husband. They saw what had been built, not from money, but from nights spent holding fevers at bay, and mornings that began with peeling potatoes beside someone who understood hunger. By spring, the sound of children laughing through the yard replaced the ghosts of silence. The old ledger now sat openly on the mantel, and on its final page in Josephine's careful handwriting it read, Josephine Langley Walker, head of household by heart if not by law. No one questioned it, not anymore. Spring came slowly, as if the earth itself had paused to watch the house on Dry Creek Ridge become what no one believed it could. The snow melted in patches, leaving behind crooked footprints, bent fence posts, and the stubborn beginnings of life. In the far corner of the yard where Richard Walker once dreamed of building a chicken coop, Tom planted tomatoes quietly with steady hands. Liza now stood beside Ruth in the kitchen, learning how to keep the fire at just the right heat, how to stir with purpose. The baby, once too quiet to cry, now giggled at the sound of beans rolling in a tin bowl. The children laughed louder, not in rebellion, but in comfort, like they finally believed they were allowed to. Josephine moved through the house like a current mending planting, humming teaching. Ruth to cut fabric by grain, showing Liza how to hold a crying child without flinching. She never raised her voice, but when she entered a room, things fell into rhythm. She hadn't changed the world outside, but within these worn wooden walls, something sacred had rooted. One morning the preacher returned. He didn't bring a Bible or a sermon, just stood on the porch with his hat in hand and eyes lowered in quiet respect. I came to bless the land, he said. Josephine nodded and opened the door. The next week, 2 county men returned, this time with new papers. Red seals, blue ink. Legal words wrapped in the weight of authority. Ruth answered the door. She was 13 now, taller, sharper. Her arms crossed tight, and a rusted rifle leaning beside her like punctuation. We've got a judge's order, one of the men said. Ruth didn't blink. We've got a mother. They didn't step inside. Josephine didn't need to ask what was in the satchel. Some truths carried more weight than ink ever could. By mid-spring, the children began calling her Mama, without hesitation. Not as a test, not out of habit, but as a fact as natural as sunrise. The name didn't feel borrowed anymore. It felt earned. That spring, she wrote one final letter, not to anyone specific, just to whoever might need it someday. She folded it carefully and tucked it into the back of the old ledger beside the names of each child. It read, if you find this house, know that no one here was born lucky. But each of us chose to stay, chose to love, chose to build even with nothing. So if you're lost or hungry or unsure whether the world still holds people who won't let go, come in. There's soup on the fire and a bed in the corner. We've been waiting for you. Over time, the house changed. More rooms, a porch swing, a coop full of real chickens just like Richard once sketched in that ledger. But some things never changed, the way the fire never went out, the sound of children's feet against the floorboards, the strength of a woman who had never been chosen by one man, but was claimed daily by a family she never expected to find. Not by blood, not by law, but by the only thing that ever really mattered. Love that stayed. Years passed, and the land remembered. Where once there had been dust and hollow wind, now stood a home rooted in the bones of effort. The roof held strong through storms. The porch swing creaked not with loneliness, but with the weight of stories told under moonlight. Tomato vines climbed the coop fence, where hens scratched in the dirt. 7 of them, just like the letter once promised. The children grew tall, their laughter deeper. Ruth learned how to barter with traveling peddlers, sharp-eyed and unshaken. Tom took to repairing wagons in town, his hands calloused with pride. Liza, now steadier in her steps, taught other young girls how to hold a child and not shake from it. Josephine stayed. She never remarried, never left the ridge, never stopped writing names in the ledger. The buttons she once found in the safe bone shell tin sat in a jar by the window, glinting softly with the morning sun, reminders of who they had been and what had been kept. Some days riders passed. Strangers stopped by with tired horses and hungrier eyes. No one asked if they were welcome. They simply came. And Josephine, no longer surprised, would put on the kettle and lay out another quilt near the hearth. Not all who came stayed, but the door never closed in judgment. One winter, Ruth found Josephine at the table, pen in hand, staring at the blank page of a letter she hadn't yet begun. When Ruth asked who it was for, Josephine smiled, not wide, not dramatic, but enough. "It's for the one who needs this place next," she said. Ruth nodded like she understood. Maybe she did. Outside, the sky was bruised with the promise of snow. The wind howled like it had miles to go before resting. But inside, the fire crackled steady, casting its light on the boots lined by the door. The quilt squares mended with careful fingers, and the ledger opened to a fresh page. Far-off hoofbeats echoed. Someone was coming. And in that house on Dry Creek Ridge, the table was already set. There are places we find, and there are places that find us. Josephine didn't arrive with wealth, blood ties, or a written claim. But what she gave, her time, her hands, her heart, built something stronger than any deed. In a world that often forgets those who have been left behind, she chose to stay. She chose to love without condition, to raise not just children, but hope itself. The message is simple. Family isn't always who we're born to. Sometimes it's who we choose to show up for day after day through hard winters and quiet triumphs. Maybe you've lived that truth. Maybe you've carried someone through a storm, or been carried without even realizing it. This story is a reminder that love, when given freely, becomes legacy. If that speaks to your heart, stay a while. Tap the screen to hear what happens next. And if the warmth of this story has stayed with you, give it a like or share it with someone who needs reminding that it's never too late to build something lasting. Subscribe to join us, because stories like these, like families, are better when shared. The train hissed like a beast, losing its breath as it slowed at Dry Creek Station, just a lean platform swallowed by heat, dust, and silence. June's sun blazed overhead, painting every wooden beam with a faded sorrow. Josephine Langley, 19, stepped down with 2 battered trunks and a letter she kept folded against her chest like a second heart. She had crossed 3 states for this. The man had promised everything: a home on a ridge hens for eggs, a sturdy bed, and a place to start over. She hadn't come for love. She'd come for belonging, but the station was empty. No man with calloused hands, no wagon, no horses. Just a barefoot boy, skinny and solemn, standing like he'd been waiting for disappointment. "You Miss Langley?" he asked, squinting. "Yes," she answered, her voice dry from the journey. He stared, then said it plain: "Pa's dead. Snakebite. Buried him 2 days ago." The words struck like iron dropped on bare skin. She blinked once, twice. Surely there was a mistake. "I was to marry him," she said, mostly to herself. "He said you were coming," the boy replied. "That's why he wrote. Said maybe you'd still come anyway." Josephine gripped the handle of her trunk harder. Her mouth tasted like rust. Still come anyway. For what? A memory. A grave. "How many of you are there?" she asked. 7. "Well, 6 now. Jenny died last winter." He looked away, then back. "I'm the oldest. I'm Tom." Behind her, the train exhaled and pulled off like it already knew she wasn't getting back on. She stared at the red clay underfoot, at the sky that offered no answers. Then she looked at Tom again, barefoot, thin, steady. He was no older than 10, but already more man than most. "Where's the house?" she whispered. "Past the ridge." "Is it big?" "It's small. So am I." He didn't smile. Just picked up one of her trunks like he'd done it before and turned. Josephine followed, not with purpose, but because turning back felt worse. She had come to marry a man. Instead, she met a ghost and 6 children watching her, like she might be the last thing standing between them and the wind. The letter had promised warmth, but what waited for her beyond that ridge was grief, silence, and a home where hope had been rationed long before she ever arrived. And yet, she didn't walk away.